Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. This is Joe, the bearded historian. He'll tell you an interesting story. Be careful of his soldiers, they can be brats. This is Angel, she's an entity. She'll cause chaos and plant her hands at you. This is Sue, she likes spirits, not the alcohol. She's the reason this channel exists. This is David, he likes fire trucks. He's here occasionally. Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. We preserve his story.
Happy Valentine's Day! We did a short. Angel's working on an animation, which hopefully will be done before the end of the month. She's been working on it for a couple of weeks now, so these things take time. But she's at the midpoint, I think. Anyway, it's coming. Now, usually I would do a race. But a couple of our followers, very sweet, awesome people, had a special event that they shared yesterday. They got married. So, in honor of their new status, we're going to honor them with our Valentine's Day shout out because I feel like it's a perfect time to do it for them. Are you ready? Here we go. Shout out time. Here's a shout out just for you. You support me, so I support you. The shout out is for our friends. This is for Nick and Joe, our Gen X explorers. Yeah. All right, as you can see, they're a cute couple. We'll go here and here. And it says, welcome to Gen X Explorers. Nick and Jill, a dynamic Gen X couple. They embark on thrilling adventures and ignite your curiosity and bring you along on a voyage of discovery. I can read words. I really can. They do hiking, day trips, food reviews, mountains, lakes, coastals, cultural tours. They are a very cute couple. They also have a second channel, which is not as active. Hold on a minute. Which apparently they haven't used in 11 months. I didn't realize it's been that long. They used to do little shorts on this one. Apparently they've narrowed it down to one, which is fine. No problems with that. Either way, I'm going to list both channels because I can. And I want you to wish them congratulations and a happy Valentine's Day. And here is the video. Not a well, I guess technically it's a Valentine's Day video, but history. Enjoy. Alright, bearded historian, what are we doing today?
Well, my wife and her ability to find and cultivate interesting items and tidbits of historical reference. We have one that dates back to the 14th of February. This one here, interestingly enough, we're not sure when the guy's end date was. Because we're going to be talking about James Riddle Hoffa. For those of you who are not quite up on mafia and the fun stuff that happens in labor, Hoffa was born in Brazil, Indiana on the 14th in 1913 to John and Viola Hoffa. His father, who is German descent from what is now referred to as Pennsylvania Dutch, died in 1920 from lung disease when Hoffa was only 7 years old.
Oh, wow.
So he lost his dad young.
Obviously.
His mother was of Irish ancestry. The family moved to Detroit in 1924, where Hoffa was raised and lived for the rest of his life. He left school at the age of 14 and began working full-time manual jobs to help support his family. Now, Hoffa would marry Josephine Posłak, an 18-year-old Detroit laundry worker of Polish heritage in Bowling Green, Ohio, on September the 25th, 1937. The couple had met 6 months earlier during a non-unionized laundry workers' strike action. And they had 2 children, a daughter, Barbara Ann Crancer, and a son, James P. Hoffa. The Hoffas paid $6,800 in 1939 for a modest home in northwestern Detroit. The family later owned a simple summer lakefront cottage in the Orion Township, Michigan, north of Detroit. Well, Hoffa began union organizational work at a grassroots level as a teenager through his job and with a grocery chain, which paid substandard wages and offered poor working conditions with minimal job security. The workers were displeased with the situation and tried to organize a union to better their lot. However, although Hoffa was young, his courage and approachability in that role impressed the fellow workers, and he rose to a leadership position. By 1923, after refusing to work for an abusive shift foreman, Hoffa left the grocery chain, partially because of his union activities. He was then invited to become an organizer with the local 299 of the Teamsters in Detroit. Well, the Teamsters were founded back in 1903, had 75,000 members in 1933.
Wow.
As a result of Hoffa's work with other union leaders to consolidate the local union trucker groups into regional sections and then into a national body, Hoffa ultimately completed over 2 decades. Membership grew to 170,000 members by 1936, and 3 years later, there were 420,000.
Wow.
Now, that number grew steadily during World War II, and in the post-war boom, it would top over 1 million members by 1951. Now, the Teamsters organized truck drivers and warehousemen throughout the Midwest and then nationwide. Hoffa played a major role in the union's skillful use of quickie strikes, secondary boycotts, and other means of leveraging union strength at one company, and then moved to organize workers and finally to win contract demands at other companies. This process, which took several years starting in the early 1930s, eventually brought the Teamsters to a position of being one of the most powerful unions in the United States. Now, trucking unions in that era were heavily influenced and, in many cases, controlled by elements of organized crime. For Hoffa to unify and expand trucking unions, he had to make accommodations and arrangements with many gangsters, beginning in the Detroit area. Organized crime influence on the IBT increased as the union itself grew. Well, Hoffa could work to defend the Teamsters from raids by other unions, including the Congress of Industrial Organizations, and he extended the Teamsters' influence in the Midwest from the late 1930s to the late 1940s. Although he never actually worked as a truck driver, he became president of the local 299 in December of 1946. He then rose to lead the combined group of Detroit area locals shortly afterwards, and later advanced to become the head of the Michigan Teamsters groups. Meanwhile, Hoffa obtained a deferment from military service in World War II by skillfully making a case for his union leadership skills being of more value to the nation by keeping freight running smoothly to assist the war effort. Now that takes intelligence.
I mean, not wrong.
Yeah, let's keep the bullets and the parts moving, guys. Now, in 1952, the IBT convention in Los Angeles, Hoffa was selected as the national vice president by incoming President David Beck, who the successor to Daniel J. Tobin, who had been president since 1907. Hoffa had quelled an internal revolt against Tobin by securing the Central States regional support for Beck at the convention, and in exchange, Beck made Hoffa a vice president. Let's trade titles. The IBT moved to the headquarters from Indianapolis to Washington, D.C., taking over a large office building in the Capitol in 1955. The IBT staff was also meanwhile enlarged, with many lawyers hired to assist with contract negotiations. Following the 1952 election as vice president, Hoffa began spending more of his time away from Detroit, either in Washington or traveling around the country for his expanded responsibilities. Hoffa's personal lawyer was Bill Buffalino. Now, Hoffa took over the presidency of the Teamsters in 1957 at the convention in Miami Beach, Florida. Beck, his predecessor, had appeared before the John L. McClellan-led U.S. Senate Select Committee on Improper Activities in Labor or Management Field. That's one heck of a long title. In March of 1957, and took the Fifth Amendment 140 times. I'm not saying nothing. in response to his questions, Beck was later indicted with IBT convention took place and was convicted and imprisoned in a trial for fraud held in Seattle. Well, 1957 AFL-CIO convention held in Atlantic City, New Jersey, voted nearly 5-1 to expel the IBT. Vice President Walter Reuther led the fight to oust the IBT on charges that Hoffa was a corrupt leader. Now, President George Meany gave an emotional speech advocating the removal of the IBT and stating that he could only agree to further affiliation of the Teamsters if they dismissed Hoffa as their president. Meany demanded a response from Hoffa, who replied through the press, "We'll see." At the time, the IBT was bringing in over $750,000 annually to the AFL-CIO. Yeah, that's a lot of freaking money.
Especially back then.
Yeah. Now, following the re-election as president in 1961, Hoffa worked to expand the union. In 1964, he succeeded in bringing virtually all the over-the-road truck drivers in North America under a single national master freight agreement, which may have been his biggest achievement in a lifetime of union activity. Hoffa then tried to bring airline workers and other transport employees into the union with limited success. He was then facing immense personal strain as he is under investigation, on trial, launching appeals of convictions, or imprisoned for virtually all of the 1960s.
What?
Very popular. Hoffa was reelected without opposition to a third 5-year term as president of the IBT, despite having been convicted of jury tampering and mail fraud on court verdicts that were stayed pending review of the appeal. Delegates of Miami Beach also elected Frank Fitzsimmons as the first vice president, who would become president if Hoffa has to serve a jail term. Well, Hoffa had faced major criminal investigations in 1957 as a result of the McClellan Committee, and on March 14, 1957, Hoffa was arrested for allegedly trying to bribe an aide to the Select Committee. Hoffa denied the charges and was later acquitted, but the arrest triggered additional investigations, more arrests, and indictments over the following weeks. When John F. Kennedy was elected president in 1960, he appointed his younger brother Robert as the Attorney General. Robert Kennedy had been frustrated in early attempts to convict Hoffa while working as counsel to the McClellan Subcommittee. As Attorney General from 1961, Kennedy pursued a strong attack on the organized crime when he carried on the so-called Get Hoffa squad of prosecutors and investigators. Gee, you can't tell who they're going after, can you? In May of 1963, Hoffa was indicted for jury tampering in Tennessee, charged with attempted bribery of a grand juror in the 1962 conspiracy trial in Nashville. Hoffa was convicted on March 4, 1964, subsequently sentenced to 8 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. While on bail during his appeal, Hoffa was convicted of a second trial held in Chicago on July 26, 1964, of 1 count of conspiracy and 3 counts of mail and wire fraud for improper use of the Teamsters Pension Fund, and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Hoffa would spend the next 3 years unsuccessfully appealing the 64 convictions. Appeals filed by the Chief Counsel, St. Louis Defense Attorney Morris Schinker, reached the United States Supreme Court. He began serving his aggregate prison sentence of 13 years, 8 for bribery, 5 for fraud, on March 7, 1967, at the Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania. Well, while Hoffa entered prison, Frank Fitzsimmons was named the acting president of the union, and Hoffa planned to run the union from prison through Fitzsimmons. Now, Fitzsimmons was a Hoffa loyalist, fellow Detroit resident, and longtime member of the Teamsters Local 299, who owed his high position in large part to Hoffa's influence. Despite this, Fitzsimmons soon distanced himself from Hoffa's influence and control after 1967 to Hoffa's displeasure. Fitzsimmons also decentralized power somewhat within the IBT's administration structure, foregoing much of the control Hoffa took advantage of as union president. While still in prison, Hoffa resigned as Teamsters president on June 19, 1971, and Fitzsimmons was elected the Teamsters president on July 9, 1971. Now, on December the 23rd, 1971, less than 5 years into his 13-year prison sentence, Hoffa was released from prison when U.S. President Richard Nixon commuted his time served. As a result, Hoffa's previous resignation, he was awarded a $1.75 million lump sum termination benefit from the Teamsters Retirement and Family Protection Plan. That type of pension settlement had never occurred with the Teamsters. The IBT then endorsed Nixon, a Republican, in his presidential re-election bid in 1972. In prior elections, the Union had normally supported Democratic nominees, but had endorsed Nixon in 1960. Well, Hoffa regained his freedom, but the commutation from Nixon did not allow Hoffa to engage in any direct or indirect management of any labor organization until March 6, 1980. Hoffa contended that he had never agreed to that condition. Hoffa accused senior Nixon administration figures, including Attorney General John M. Mitchell and White House Special Counsel Charles Colson, of depriving him of his rights by imposing that condition. It was suspected that the condition had been imposed upon Hoffa because of the request from the Teamsters leadership, but that was denied by Fitzsimmons. In 1973, Hoffa was planning to seize the presidency of the Teamsters yet again. Now, Hoffa sued to invalidate that restriction so that he could reassert his power over the Teamsters. John Dean, former White House counsel to Nixon, was among those called upon for depositions in 1974 court proceedings. Dean, who had become famous as a government witness in prosecutions arising from the Watergate scandal in the mid-1973, had drafted the clause in 1971 at Nixon's request. Hoffa ultimately lost his court battle since the court ruled that Nixon had acted within his powers by imposing the restriction, as it had been based on Hoffa's misconduct when he was serving as a Teamsters official. Well, Hoffa faced immediate immense resistance from his reestablishment of power from many corners and had lost much of his earlier support, even in the Detroit area. As a result, he intended to be getting his comeback at the local level of the Local 299 in Detroit, where he regained some influence. In 1975, Hoffa was working on his autobiography, Hoffa, The Real Story, which was published a few months after his disappearance. He also had earlier published a book titled The Trials of Jimmy Hoffa in 1970. Well, Hoffa's plan to regain the leadership of the Union was met with opposition from several members of the Mafia. One of them was Anthony Provenzano, who was a Teamsters local leader in New Jersey and the national vice president of the Union during Hoffa's second term as president. Provenzano had once been a friend of the Hoffa, but had become his enemy after a reported feud with both were in federal prison at Lewisburg, Pennsylvania in the 60s. In 1973 and 74, Hoffa asked him for his support to regain his former position, but Provenzano refused and threatened Hoffa by reportedly saying he would kidnap and eviscerate his grandchildren.
Well then.
Provenzano was a Caprio regime in the New York City Genovese crime family. At least two of the Provenzano's Union opponents had been murdered, and others who had spoken out against him had also been assaulted. Now, other Mafia figures who became involved were Anthony Giacconi, the alleged kingpin of the Detroit Mafia, and his younger brother Vito. The FBI believes that they were positioning themselves as mediators between Hoffa and Provenzano. The brothers had made 3 visits to Hoffa's home in Lake Orion and one to the Guardian Building law offices. Their avowed purpose in meeting Hoffa was to set up a peace meeting between Provenzano and Hoffa. Now, Hoffa's son, James, said Dad was pushing so hard to get back in office it was increasingly afraid that the mob would do something about it. James was convinced that the peace meeting was a pretext to Gauchioni's setting Dad up for a hit, since Hoffa had been increasingly uneasy each time that the Gauchioni brothers arrived. Now, Hoffa disappeared on July 30th, 1975, after he had been gone out to the meeting with Provenzano and Gauchioni. The meeting was due to take place at 2 p.m. at the March's Red Fox restaurant in the Bloomfield Township, a Detroit suburb. The place was known to Hoffa and had been the site of the wedding reception for his son James. Hoffa wrote Gauchioni's initials and the time and the location of the meeting on his office calendar, TG 2 p.m. Red Fox. Well, Hoffa had left his home at 1:15.
Goodness.
And before heading to the restaurant, he stopped at the office of close friend Louis Letourneau, former president of the Teamsters Local 614, and now ran a limousine service. Letourneau and Hoffa had been enemies early in their career, but eventually became friends. When Hoffa left prison, Letourneau also had become Hoffa's unofficial appointment secretary and arranged a dinner meeting between Hoffa and the Guccione brothers on July 26, in which they had informed him of the July 30th meeting. Letourneau was out to lunch when Hoffa stopped by, and Hoffa talked to some of the staff present, left a message for Letourneau before he left for the Mauritius Red Fox. Now, between 2:15 and 2:30, an annoyed Hoffa called his wife from a payphone on a post in front of the Damon Hardware, directly behind their Mauritius Red Fox, and complained that Guccione had not shown up and that he had been stood up. His wife told him that she had not heard from anyone. He told her he would be home at 4 o'clock to grill steaks for dinner. Several witnesses saw him standing by his car and pacing the restaurant's parking lot. Two men saw Hoffa, recognized him, and stopped to chat with him briefly and shake his hand. Hoffa also made a call to Letourneau, in which he again complained that the men were late. Letourneau gave the time as 3:30, but the FBI suspected that it was earlier based on the timing of the other phone calls from Letourneau's office around that time. The FBI estimates that Hoffa left the location without a struggle around 2:45 to 2:50 p.m. One witness reported seeing Hoffa in the back of a maroon Lincoln and Mercury car with 3 other people. Well, at 7 a.m. the next day, Hoffa's wife called her son and daughter to say the father had not come home. At 7:20, Letourneau went to the Mauritius Red Fox and found Hoffa's unlocked car in the parking lot, but there was no sign of Hoffa nor any indication what had happened to him. He called the police, who later arrived at the scene. Michigan State Police were brought in, and the FBI was alerted. By 6 p.m., Hoffa's son James filed a missing persons report. The Hoffa family offered a $200,000 reward for any information about that disappearance. Now, the primary piece of physical evidence obtained in the investigation was a maroon 1975 Mercury Marquis Brougham, which belonged to Anthony Garcione's son, Joseph. The car had been borrowed earlier that day by Charles Chucky O'Brien to deliver fish. O'Brien was Hoffa's foster son, although relations between them had soured in the years preceding Hoffa's disappearance. Investigations and Hoffa's family suspected that O'Brien had a role in the Hoffa disappearance, and on August 21st, police dogs identified Hoffa's scent in the car.
Ooh.
Well, Guccione and Proviano, who had denied having scheduled a meeting with Hoffa, were found not to have been near the restaurant that afternoon. According to Time, Proviano had been seen fraternizing with local union members in Hoboken, although Proviano told investigators that he was playing cards with Stephen Andretta, Thomas Andretta's brother, in Union City, New Jersey, the day that Hoffa disappeared. Well, despite extensive surveillance and bugging, investigators found that the mafia members who they thought were involved were generally unwilling to talk about the Hoffa's disappearance.
What?
Who would talk about the mafia?
Why would the mafia not want to talk to the cops?
I don't know. Something
That
about
makes no
disappearing,
sense.
you know?
That can't be.
Hoffa's already vanished. On December the 4th, 1975, a federal investigator in Detroit sat in court presided by James Paul Churchill that a witness had identified 3 New Jersey men who had participated in the abduction and murder of James R. Hoffa. The 3 men were close associates of Provenzano, Thomas Andretta, Salvatore Bariglio, and his brother Gabriel Bariglio. Later in 75, Michigan Attorney General Frank J. Kelly went to the Waterford Township to supervise an unsuccessful digging expedition for Hoffa. Now, after years of investigation, numerous law officials, including the FBI, officials have not been able to reach a definitive conclusion to the Hoffa's fate and who was involved. Hoffa's wife, Josephine, died on September the 12th, 1980, and was interred at the Whitechapel Memorial Cemetery in Troy, Michigan. And December 9th, 1982, Hoffa was declared legally dead as of July 30th, 1982, by the Oakland County, Michigan probate judge Norman R. Bernard. In 1989, Kenneth Walton, an agent in charge of the FBI's Detroit office, told the Detroit News that he knew what had happened to Hoffa. Uncomfortable, I know who did it, but I'm never going to be able to be it's never going to be able to be prosecuted because it would divulge informants and confidential sources. In 2001, the FBI matched DNA from Hoffa's hair, taken from a brush, with a strand found in Joseph Guccione's car, but it's possible Hoffa had traveled in the car on a different day. In June 16th, 2006, the Detroit Free Press published the entire Hoffa's memo, a 56-page report prepared by the FBI for a January 1976 briefing on the case in FBI headquarters in Washington. Although not claiming conclusively to establish specifics for the disappearance, the memo records the belief that Hoffa was murdered at the behest of the organized crime figures who regarded his efforts to regain power of the Teamsters as a threat for their control of the union's pension fund. In the Hoffa's memo, it was concluded, based on the evidence, that Chucky O'Brien was determined as a pathological liar, was driving the Joseph Garciani's maroon 1975 Mercury the day of the disappearance. Also, James Hoffa was seated in the right rear seat of the car. His body scent was picked up by the dogs, as well as a piece of his hair was also found from under the back seat. Pump-action 12-gauge shotgun was seized from the trunk, as well as the several 22 and 38 caliber bullets. And as of 2021, digs are still periodically conducted in the Detroit area in search of Hoffa's body, but the common theory is among experts that the body was cremated. But, there's been further details. Further people have speculated that he was buried in the out in New Jersey under where the stadium was built. There's a good place to bury it. But they also did ground-penetrating radar and never found anything. But
you think about it, if they were to cremate him and then put his ashes into the building itself,
right, he would be concreted. So yeah,
he could literally be there but not be able to be detected.
Exactly.
There's a lot of places that you could hide it without not being able to detect it.
But as it goes, Hoffa was a powerful man in his day and age. He helped build the Teamsters, and eventually it slowly undid his future because he had to work with the mafia and other connections. But today we'll be celebrating Hoffa by running around the countryside, probably not finding anywhere near Hoffa. Because we're in South Dakota and he was over in Michigan. But this has been the Bearded Historian. You folks have a good one. We'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.